So let's give this a shot now. Let's try to write our own conclusion. Here's the thesis. I've given you a thesis. I've given you claims. And your task is to write a conclusion that ties the claims back to the thesis. Now, I know we haven't tried this yet. However, I do want you to try this on your own before kind of watching me do it. So give this your best shot. Pause the video. Try to write a conclusion that relates these claims back to this thesis. And then when you're done, give this an unpause. Okay. So I have an example here as well. I'm going to copy and paste. Our thesis. It is important to invest in renewable energy research. So presumably the topic was asking, create an argument about whether or not you think it's important to invest in renewable energy. Our thesis is that it is important to invest in renewable energy research, and the claims that we use throughout our essay are that we will eventually run out of non-renewable energy, fossil fuels like coal and oil pollute the air, and that additional research can lead to improvements that make renewable energy cheaper and more efficient. So if we wanted to tie these claims back to this thesis, we could write a conclusion like this. Relying largely on fossil fuels will not be sustainable for the future of humanity. Because humans will eventually run out of non-renewable fossil fuels, and because the burning of these fossil fuels continues to decimate air quality through pollution, it is necessary to transition to renewable energy sources. Investing in renewable energy research is imperative to make renewable energy an affordable, efficient, and realistic replacement for fossil fuels. Short and to the point, right? Only 3 sentences here, and it does the job. Our thesis is that it's important. We say that it's important, right? It is necessary. Investing is imperative, right? And the reason we say that that's the case, the reason it's necessary, the reason it's imperative is because of these claims, right? Because humans will eventually run out of these fuels, because we need to make these fuels more affordable, efficient, and cheaper, and all of that, right? That's this claim. Eventually run out, that's this claim. Decimate air quality, that's this claim, right? We're taking all of our claims and we are combining them with our thesis, relating them back to our thesis. So hopefully that is clear. If it's not clear, honestly, don't. The conclusion's not the most important part. What we're about to talk about is way more important than the conclusion. And also what we're about to talk about will clarify this as well. Because we haven't really talked about what claims are in detail yet, and we're going to. And that once we talk about what claims are, this whole process will make a little bit more sense. So if you are still unclear about this, watch through the rest of this lesson, and then you can rewind and go back to this. And I think if you are unclear, it'll be a lot more clear. Body paragraphs. So body paragraphs have more goals than the introduction and the conclusion. The body paragraphs are where most of the points are going to come from, right? As we talked about in the introduction, that has your thesis. That's 1 point. But evidence and commentary is 4 points. And evidence and commentary is going to come solely from your body paragraphs. Sophistication's everywhere. It's all of your different paragraphs. But 4 of the 6 points are solely located in your body paragraphs. The goals of your body paragraphs: make claims that support the thesis, present evidence that supports the claims, and then provide commentary that explains how the evidence supports the claims and how the claims support the thesis. That's what your body paragraphs do. Each body paragraph should focus only on one claim. So if you have 3 body paragraphs, that's 3 claims. If you have 2 body paragraphs, 2 claims. 4 body paragraphs, you need 4 claims. As we kind of already talked about, 3 is the recommended number because 3 is enough to properly support a thesis in like 99% of cases, and is also usually doable within the time provided. If you only have 2 claims, you can write 2 body paragraphs. Just make sure that those 2 claims and the evidence you have for those 2 claims are sufficient to support your thesis. There has to be enough in there to support the thesis. On the other hand, if you have 4 claims, you can write 4 body paragraphs, and that would be stronger as long as you have enough time to do so. So here's the relationship between theses, claims, and evidence. They're terms we've thrown about a whole lot. Hopefully this graphic kind of makes it make sense, right? Your thesis is your main argument. That is your main point. That's what your entire essay is about. You're going to have either, 2 through 4, but most of the time, 3 claims that support that thesis. Claims are kind of like big reasons why your thesis is true. As we saw earlier in this example, the thesis was that it's important to invest in renewable energy research, right? And our 3 claims were like big, major reasons why. We will eventually run out of non-renewable energy, fossil fuels like coal and oil pollute the air, and that additional research can lead to improvements that makes renewable energy more efficient. Those are the major reasons why it's important to invest in renewable energy research. Then, so your claims support your thesis, right? They explain why your thesis is true. Then you have evidence that supports your claims. And your evidence will kind of prove that your claims are true. So it's this whole chain reaction, right? I don't know why I'm redrawing the thing that's already on the screen. I think my hand just needs something to do while I talk. But that's the idea. Thesis, the big argument. Claims, major reasons why your thesis is true. And then evidence is just evidence that proves that your claims are true. Little kind of pyramid thing going on. So let's talk about the thesis first. We've already talked about it a little bit. The thesis is the foundation of your essay. Everything that you write should relate back to your thesis. Your thesis is the most important thing, right? It's fully in charge. It's like the king of your essay, right? And everyone works for the king. And because of that, you can come up with a thesis, or you should come up with a thesis, before writing anything else. I know the thesis isn't the first thing you write, right? You introduce the topic first, then you give your thesis statement. But before you write anything, you need to know why you're writing. And if you don't have a thesis, you don't know why you're writing yet. Come up with that thesis first. Think about, all right, what is my argument? What am I trying to prove? What is my stance on what the prompt is asking me? That's what your thesis is. So we've already talked about this a little bit, so I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. This prompt, in 1891, Irish author Oscar Wilde observed, "Disobedience in the eyes of anyone who has read history is man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made, through disobedience and through rebellion." So we have a quote here. Wilde claims that disobedience is a valuable human trait and that it promotes social progress. Write an essay that argues your position on the extent to which Wilde's claims are valid. Use appropriate examples from your reading experience to support your argument. Okay, so it wants to know your position on whether or not his claims are valid. So you have 3 options, right? And they don't need to be written exactly this way. Technically, you have way more than 3 options, right? Because you could have the same positions written in different ways. But you have 3 potential positions that you can take. You can either say that disobedience is a valuable human trait that promotes social progress, right? You can agree with his claim. You could have a disagreeing position. Disobedience is not a valuable trait and it does not promote social progress. Or you can have this weird other third position, which is still a clear position. Disobedience is a valuable trait that can promote social progress, but only in certain situations. Now you might say, oh, that's a neutral thing, right? You said not to do that. It's not neutral. It still takes a clear position, right? Your position is that it can promote social progress, but only in certain situations. And then you would have to argue in the rest of the essay what those certain situations are and why it does in those situations, and then what some of the other situations are where it doesn't, right? You would need to give evidence of both. This third type is kind of the hardest to do. I would recommend sticking to one of the top 2. I think they're much easier. But this is something you can do if you would like to. You just have to be careful that you adequately support everything that your thesis says, right? So instead of just arguing one position, instead of just arguing it's valuable or it's not valuable, you have to argue that it is valuable in some situations, and you also have to argue that it's not valuable in other situations. Those are your options for theses. So let's do some practice. Let's write a thesis here. We've done activities related to thesis, right? We have written a thesis statement already. Let's practice another one, because the thesis is important. That's your entire essay depends on your thesis. So give this one a shot. Read over this prompt. write a thesis statement for this and unpause when you're done, and you can compare yours to mine. Okay. So the prompt says, for centuries, prominent thinkers have pondered the relationship between ownership and the development of self-identity, ultimately asking the question, what does it mean to own something? Plato argues that owning objects is detrimental to a person's character. Aristotle claims that ownership of tangible goods helps to develop moral character. 20th century philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, I don't actually know who that person is, I apologize to anyone that's interested in philosophy, proposes that ownership extends beyond objects to include intangible things as well. In Sartre's view, becoming proficient in some skill and knowing something thoroughly means that we own it. Think about the differing views of ownership. Then write an essay in which you explain your position on the relationship between ownership and sense of self. Use appropriate evidence from your reading, experience, or observations to support your argument. So this prompt is way more open-ended than most. If we looked at the previous one, right, we really only have 3 options. We have more options in this one. We can adopt one of the 3 positions that are given to us, right, which is that owning objects is detrimental, ownership of tangible goods helps develop moral character, that ownership extends beyond objects to include intangible things as well. Or you could come up with your own completely different position on ownership and what it means to own things and whether or not it's good to own things, etc. So there's a lot of flexibility here. This kind of prompt is rare. It's rare that you have this much flexibility, but it's good to practice what to do in this situation. Also, we have some really juicy information to use to introduce the topic here, right? Even if we don't choose any of these positions, these are things we can use in that introduction to kind of set up for our own thesis statement. So here are some options. Our thesis could be that ownership extends beyond objects to include skills and ideas, and the aggregate of what an individual owns defines his or her character. We could say ownership applies only to objects and that it is detrimental to an individual's character. We could say ownership applies only to objects and it's beneficial in developing an individual's character. We could say ownership does not have any impact on an individual's character. We could say ownership applies to both tangible objects and intangible ideas, and while it does influence an individual's character, it does not define that person's character, etc., etc., etc. There's a million different ways we could go with this. But it has to be related to your view of ownership and your position on the relationship between ownership and sense of self. As long as it fits that criteria, and as long as you're able to support it with claims and evidence, you're good to go. Speaking of claims, let's talk about them. We've used this word a whole bunch. Let's actually talk about, in depth what a claim is. As I kind of alluded to earlier, your claims are the major points that you present as to why your thesis is correct. They support your thesis, but they in turn need to be supported by evidence, right? So you don't want something super ultra specific. You want something more general. That way you can come up with evidence to support it. If you have something super specific that, is the evidence as your claim, you're not going to be able to come up with more evidence for it, right? If, for example, if your thesis is, recycling is good, and one of your claims is, results from some survey that was in one of the sources, well, how are you supposed to come up with more evidence to support why these survey results are correct, right? Those survey results are not going to be your claim. That's going to be your evidence. Your claim is going to be whatever the results of that survey show. So, if your claim is recycling is good, and you have information about, how recycling can keep plastic out of water, your claim could be recycling is good because it keeps plastic out of the ocean. And then you could support that with here's a study that shows that this is true, right? Here's, whatever else. You get the idea. And finally, each claim will be the main idea of a body paragraph, right? We talked about each body paragraph focuses on one claim. That claim is the main idea of that body paragraph. Everything else in that body paragraph should be related to that claim. It should either be evidence that supports that claim, commentary, which we'll talk about in a second, that connects the evidence to the claim, or commentary that connects the claim to the thesis. But it has to be in some way related to that claim in order to be put in that body paragraph. So let's write some claims. We're looking at this same prompt here. We're going to use whatever thesis you chose earlier. And I want you to come up with 3 claims to support that thesis. So whichever one you chose, stick with it. You know, whatever you chose is going to kind of influence what your claims look like. Stick with whichever one you chose, come up with 3 claims for it, pause the video, and when you're done, unpause. Okay, so here are some examples that I had written out. If using the first thesis above, so the first thesis was ownership extends beyond objects to include skills and ideas, and the aggregate of what an individual owns defines his or her character. One of your claims could be that knowledge that people learn throughout their lifetimes impact the way that they behave and the decisions that they make. And then if you did that, right, that entire paragraph, that entire body paragraph that focuses on this claim would revolve around that, right? You'd present evidence, maybe about an example of some way that, you know, knowledge impacts the way people behave, or the decisions they make, etc. If using the second thesis above, ownership applies only to objects and is detrimental to an individual's character. One of your claims could be that the desire to own material objects leads to greed, which makes people act in immoral ways. And again, right, your entire body paragraph that claim is presented in would focus on that. And you could maybe give evidence of people that maybe you know about where their desire to own material objects made them act in immoral ways. You could talk about like some historical figure, right? Like Boss Tweed from, I think it was like the 1800s in New York. He was like a mayor of New York or something like that. Or, I mean, you could talk about, I don't know, any corporation, really. You could talk about slave labor in the mines, right? They wanted to make lots of money, so they hired, or they used, in the mines, I combined slave labor and child labor. But you could use either of those, right? Plantation owners used slaves because it was the cheapest way to grow their crops, and it allowed them to make the most money. Or child labor was cheaper than adult labor in the mines or in the factories. So they used children because they were able to make more money that way. Those could be your evidence that supports this claim, and then this claim supports your thesis that ownership is bad. I was about to ask if anyone has any questions about that. Obviously, it wouldn't make sense for me to ask that. But that's claims. Those are the foundation of your body paragraphs.